talkers.
So, Jay Martin, why are all property owners or landlords in New York right now, why are they all so unhappy these days?
Right.
I'll give you a nice, easy one to start.
Are we starting now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Why are they so unhappy? Well, since 2019, the rent stabilization laws, as you know, were drastically amended. And as many of our owners already know that, but it's completely changed how they operate their businesses. And I think it's negative to the effect of, it's negative to the fact that, we're seeing values off 40, sometimes 60%. I posted a building in my Twitter a few days ago where the NOI for the year was $34,000. And I think that's even optimistic based on the expenses that they were putting out. So, they feel like they're under attack constantly from lawmakers and policymakers when they should be being helped. I mean, few people realize that this is the largest affordable housing stock in the entire world, and it's unsubsidized. So no property owner gets a direct tax benefit or subsidy just for owning a property that's supposed to be affordable. The affordability provided through rent stabilization is through regulation. So it requires that every time an expense goes up, the Rent Guidelines Board is supposed to take the expenses, do the math, figure out a way that a rent increase will be proportional to cover those expenses. Well, we know for the last 10 years, Rent Guidelines Board increases haven't even kept up with inflation, let alone expenses. Perfect example is last year, fuel costs, energy costs were up 19%. Last year, the RGB had predicted them to go up by 2%. So that difference consistently happens in their numbers and their projections. So that's one of many reasons why they're upset. And two, that there's no correlation between the expectation to provide quality housing while these expenses continue to go up, and an understanding that the rents must proportionally go up to help increase the revenue, not profit, mind you, revenue to cover these continued mandates from both the city council and state level. So I think the confluence of that, plus the interest rates, plus COVID, we're still dealing with $1 billion in rent arrears hangover there, housing court not operating. It's a tough time for the industry. So, we're always looking for glimmers of hope, and I think we've been able to change the narrative as to what the average property owner is attempting to do with their properties and why they hold their properties for 20 years or more, which is the average for our owner. This isn't a churn and burn industry. These are folks who are making long-term, sustained investments in New York. They should be incentivized to do so. They should be helped to do so by the government. So that message is resonating with lawmakers, and I think with time will help change some of where we are in the industry.
Talking of rent arrears, a lot of our clients in uptown, the Bronx, they obviously struggle with the collections. And I know during COVID that they have the ERAP program and just to help fill any deficit. Is the ERAP program still going? It's how do owners navigate sort of challenging?
Yeah, so the ERAP program's essentially done, but the hangover effects are still very much being dealt with. So there is no funding left to pay out rent arrears. The court process, however, has gone from pre-COVID an average 6 to 8 months to get a judgment. And I'm not talking about an eviction. I'm not talking about the attempt for an owner to get possession of the unit. I'm simply talking about an owner filing a non-payment proceeding, because we know 90% of cases in housing court are just for payment. They're not for an owner's attempt to get an eviction, a physical removal of the tenant. So 90%. So you have 6 to 8 months was the timeline before. Now we're looking at 12 to 18 months. So every additional month, you're adding an arrear balance to that renter. We have now renters who are going into the eviction process, so the non-payment process, I should say, and they're coming out owing more money than they did when it started. So it's broken. It's not working. At the same time, there has been expansion of the right to counsel process, which we supported, by the way. Every renter who needs an attorney should be able to get one, either through a nonprofit or through a public defender. So should a property owner, by the way. If a property owner doesn't want to outlay thousands of dollars, they should be able to get counsel. By the way, though, what that has done is the attorneys for legal aid in many of these organizations are being told to delay the proceedings as long as possible, simply to adjourn, ask the courts for hardship claims. And what that is doing is requiring property owners then to essentially provide housing for free for months on end for more people than they did before COVID. And to your point about your membership, what we're seeing is not so much that more people are owing money, but that they're owing far more money than they ever owed before. We're seeing arrears balances 50, 60, 70. I saw a $1,200 apartment rent that had 5 years of arrears balance. So we're getting up to the $90,000, $100,000 range. That's willful. I mean, if you can't afford a $200, $300 towards rent after 5 years, there's something seriously wrong with this process. So we're advocating for government to come in and help that renter directly with subsidies before it gets to the point where we're getting up to $80,000, $100,000 arrears. Because as you know, when an owner's carrying that balance, it devalues the property itself because that's operating revenue coming away from their ability to run the building. And secondly, it's creating the system where it's essentially unfunding housing when you have additional mandates, local law 97 compliance coming down the pike, additional things that are being mandated on owners, but yet you're removing their one avenue, I should say, to collect revenue, which is what happens when somebody stops paying. I have to file a proceeding. I can't get an eviction. I have to go through the court process. And that's correct, but it has to work for both sides. And it's not.
Taking a step back, you actually have an interesting background when it comes to this, right? You grew up in an apartment. You were in a situation where you were evicted, right? Once upon a time. So I didn't know that about you, and I think it's interesting to point out that you have a unique perspective on this, having seen it from both the tenant side and now obviously more so.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I'm a renter. I've rented my whole life. My mother and I, single mom, my parents divorced when I was 4. Not a great family situation. We don't have to get into the Oprah territory here, but I'll just, underline that it wasn't the best. And my mother and I were on our own for a while, and she was working 2, 3 jobs, and we were living with an old Italian woman who couldn't make her mortgage because we couldn't pay our rent. And this woman cared for us. She cooked for us. We were a family. We were family members by that point. And so at a very early age, I really got a stark reality of the symbiotic relationship between a property owner and the renter. Both parties are relying on each other. And this woman eventually had to evict us. Not a formal eviction. We left because we couldn't pay the rent anymore. I don't even know if the apartment was legal. This was back in the 80s in Philadelphia. So, but I do know that we couldn't help her continue to pay her mortgage because her husband had passed away, and she needed to rent out part of her home to pay her mortgage. Now, the only difference to me between that and a scaling up of a multifamily business is that these individuals are being asked to supply housing, keep it maintained, keep it regulated properly, keep it, meeting up with the regulations and mandates. And they're asked to do so with one revenue stream, which is rents. And if you can understand that a small property owner has to do that, then you could simply understand that a single family or a multifamily property owner has to do the same math. And I don't think housing should be dependent on one class of people to figure out how to fund this entire ecosystem of housing. Because what happens when it doesn't work is if the rents aren't allowed to cover these costs, and they're not allowed to increase, and again, not for the benefit of simply profit or simply increasing the value of the property, but if they're not allowed to increase to simply cover the operating expenses that are coming down and being increased by the government, if they're not allowed to cover the mandated requirements on lead compliance, for example, or the electric energy efficient upgrades, et cetera. So all those things, if the rent isn't going to cover that, then the government has a responsibility to come in there in the middle ground of the process and say, well, we're going to provide a tax credit, we're going to provide subsidy, we're going to provide revenue, whatever we need to do. We're going to, more importantly, lower the property tax burden that they're facing, or the operating costs, because it cannot continue to be on property owners whether they are an old Italian woman in a single-family home in Philadelphia, or they are a family-run business, which is often what we deal with, who's owned their buildings for 60 years, who emigrated to this country for the American dream to own property, build it, turn it into a business. Whether or not wherever you fall on that spectrum, we can't rely on just those people to figure out how to make the math work between rents and the operating costs of housing.
You obviously have a passion for this business. I think you need to talk to people and stakeholders that you're dealing with. What is it like when you're going to different philosophical briefs and you're trying to rationalize with people? I'm curious how the conversations are. And
look, I look at it. I look at it very much like, first, groups of people. I ascribe very much to, look, you've got 5% of people who are jerks, 5% of people who are angels, and then in any walk of life, any group of individuals, you've got 5 who are just the worst people in the world. You've got 5% who are, probably superhuman in how great they are. And then you've got, 90% of people who are just trying to make a living. They're just doing their jobs. And I ascribe, and this is where I get some friction in the industry, is actually that most of what we see from political people, lawmakers in particular, is them just trying to survive. I think they have thousands of issues thrown at them on any given day. They're not experts in any one of these issues. There's no housing experts, real estate experts, by and large, that work in state senate, the state assembly, the city council, governor or mayor. And they're not familiar with the extreme cost to build, operate, and renovate this housing. And so they're put in a position where they have to decide, frankly, usually with very little time, whether or not, what side they want to take to preserve their own jobs. And by the way, their jobs pay for their own families and their own mortgages. So it comes down to, I don't think it's Machiavellian. I don't think it's like, oh, we're going to, certainly they're the socialists. And again, I would say they fall into that 5% category, and I'll let your listeners decide which 5% they fall into. But whether or not their end goal is to devalue properties, to end private ownership, to decommodify housing, as I like to say, the majority of ethnic lawmakers are just simply balancing, well, I have 30 tenants who harass me or call me throughout the week saying my rent's too high, my maintenance on my building isn't happening. I have to deal with that in the immediate. They may not be getting property owners, 30 property owners, different property owners every week calling them. And so they do a simple mathematical equation. Well, a majority of people who are calling me are complaining on this side of an issue and not the majority on one side. And so I think it boils down to really self-preservation at the end of the day. They're preserving their jobs. They're preserving their ability to provide for their family. And in this case, it's very much like any other job or walk of life. So that helps in dealing with people who don't understand the mathematics of running housing in New York. And I speak to them by and large. I'm hopeful that every tweet that I make, every conversation, every podcast I do will eventually get to one or two of those people to change their opinion. I know that we're lost with many of the socialists and those decommodify housing folks, because those are the people that make up by and large and make the decisions in policy in New York, the medium, the middle ground folks. And they're the ones who are pushed by the extremes on either end.
Probably surprised by the costs of operating a building as well, just because it's so expensive to running.
100%. And I think that's something as an industry we could always do better. And I think historically we hadn't done, is we have to get our expenses out. We have to open our books, so to speak, and we have to bring lawmakers into the process of running housing. We've been doing tours in our vacant units. It's one of our big issues, obviously, and within the rent stabilized, and I'm sure many of your customers and our members, the issue of ongoing vacancies in rent stabilized housing with legal, low regulated rents. Thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah, well, it was necessary because no one was talking about it. It was being written off as, well, they're making enough money on these other units. Why don't they just use the rent from other units? I've had lawmakers, I've had the housing chair in the assembly say, well, just raise rents on other units to cover those losses. Well, isn't that how we got into the problem in the first place of high rents? Like, it's like
a NIMBYism that but in the existing stock lows.
Sure, because they don't want the negative press of saying, well, we passed a policy that lets the owners raise rents on these vacant units. But that's so counterintuitive to keeping housing well maintained. You cannot run 2023 housing with 1983 rents. It just doesn't work that way. So the money has to come from somewhere. If it's not coming from the rents and if it's not coming from subsidy, you have to increase the rents on other people in the building, which is counterintuitive to the entire premise, we're told, of rent control and rent stabilization. So I think with time, it's like water on a rock. Water has the ability to erode even permanent objects. So I think with time, we will get more people to our side, but it's going to take perhaps more time than many in the industry, and we're already seeing this, can hold out. So hopefully we'll get to that point.
It strikes me that you're an educator, really, that your main task is going to these folks who, like you described, that they have many different pain points and competing ideologies and people coming at them for different things that they need. So your role, it sounds like, is staying out in front of them as much as you can, educating them on what goes on in the day-to-day life of a property owner, and explain why this is an urgent issue to address. I mean, it seems like we have a housing emergency in New York. Maybe that's something that we always have had. In other cities, same things happening, Chicago, LA. So it's not a New York-centric problem, but it certainly does seem to be an urban problem today in America, that housing, we just can't seem to agree. Is it a human right, or is it something that landlords are allowed to make money on?
Right. Well, I mean, even if it is a human right, I don't think that necessarily means we can't make money on it. I mean, that is how we've been able to incentivize through a capitalist system, raising up the bottom half of many people throughout the world, actually. I mean, capitalism is by no means like the perfect system, but it's the best system we've had so far. And it's helped improve the lives of millions and millions of people in this country and across the world. So I think until a better system comes along, we have to figure out how to make this system work. And one example I would say is Houston, not a bastion of liberalism, not a bastion of I would say left-leaning politics, but they've been able in the last 5 years to have their homeless population with a housing first model by simply building enough housing to make sure everyone had a place to live, and then worrying about how those people pay for that housing. And what we do in New York is the exact opposite. We regulate the cost to the user of the housing, but we don't before we even figure out how to build and price the housing. So I make this claim, and it always raises eyebrows, but it's true. There's no such thing as affordable housing, because when you build it, it isn't affordable. The cost to build it isn't affordable. The cost of a nail is priced the same on an affordable project as it is on a free market project. The cost of materials is the same. The labor cost is the same. The property tax, everything is the same. What makes it affordable is what the user pays, the renter. If we approached all housing development and running housing the same way and worried about the quality of it and the maintenance of it, and then worried after it's built, after it's regulated, after it's operated, about what the user cost is, and supplemented the user cost, then we would get more housing. And I think other states have shown that if you build first and then let the market meet the demand, as they've been able to do in other cities with much more open zoning regulations, much more favorable property tax systems, then I think we will see quickly that this is much more an issue of a smaller population of people who can't afford to live in a city. We will bring overall rents down to a more realistic medium than what we're currently seeing in these extremes in the market. And you'll have enough housing for everybody who lives there. I mean, there are 3.1 million renters and 2.2 million units of housing. I mean, a lot of that is families, but a lot of that is also, we just don't have enough housing for the amount of people who live there. And we happen to have added 100,000 people every 6 months for the last 2 years. I know there's been a population loss of permanent residents, but we also have a migrant population that's influx, and they need somewhere to live, whether or not you want them living here permanently, whatever your political position. Either way, New York has not kept up with the housing it's need, to your point, for 100 years. And their solution, rent control and rent stabilization, hasn't done anything to add more supply.
Okay. Practically speaking, how in Houston, for example, how is that funded then? If it's build first, where are those funds coming from?
Well, they build as if it's not going to be affordable. And then those who need subsidy to afford the rents are provided.
So they build it and then the market kicks in.
Correct.
To define who's...
Correct. And because they've kept up with the amount of building that they need to, the average entry point for subsidy isn't as high. So if we, for example, added 500,000 units of housing in the city over the next 10 years, a pretty high bar, but I think realistic, given the amount of capital the city has and needs, then what we would do is subsidize those who, until we get to the point where the market has met the demand and the overall demand has come down. We're seeing rents nationally come down. But if the city starts meeting the demand on the need, then I believe the rent will come down to the point where we can subsidize the renter directly until they have the purchase power through their own means to rent in this market. It's a far smarter way to solve our problem than regulating the user cost, because when you do that, you disincentivize the building, you disincentivize the operating and the taking care of these buildings. There's a reason rent-stabilized buildings have more violations than brand new buildings, and it isn't because the owners are all jerks or they don't want to run good housing. It's because you're regulating the revenue going into the building, and that directly results in worse quality housing. So let's fix that. Let's get more revenue in. Let's subsidize the revenue and look at it from the perspective of the most important thing is making the housing financially whole and then making sure that the renters can afford the housing.
Interesting. As you know, one of the ways to increase affordable housing supply is by incentivizing tax payments, and obviously the one developers have been talking about for the last 18 months or so is the 421A. What's your thoughts on that? I know it'll be discussed in the next political session in January.
Yeah.
You feeling optimistic? I know you're an optimistic guy, so I'm sure you do, but just curious to know your thoughts.
Look, I'm optimistic sometimes. I'm pessimistic. It depends on the Twitter sphere that day. I can say the conversations we just had at Somos with many of the lawmakers, I think they're split right down the middle, or whether or not anything's getting done this legislative session, or whether or not they're optimistic. I don't think anybody thinks there won't be tremendous pressure to deliver. I mean, the fact that we are down to 11,000 new units of housing in the last year produced in the entire city, it's abysmal. It's really embarrassing for both the lawmakers and I think our industry. I think not producing the amount of housing that we absolutely need to keep producing on a monthly and a yearly basis to meet demand is really a problem. And I think that pressure is always going to be there. So we, of course, support 421A, but our as rent-stabilized owners, obviously we're not in the business of developing. We're in the business of maintaining 100-year-old housing. We say to lawmakers, if you can acknowledge that 421A is needed to provide affordable housing because the cost to build is extremely expensive, then you have to acknowledge that there is a need for subsidy, a tax offset or something for operating 100-year-old buildings, because those same buildings are under the same property tax, the same labor, the same maintenance and materials, regulations, and regulatory costs that a new building is. You are exempt from, obviously, the build cost. But once the building is sold, it has the same amount of responsibility. So comparing a $700 unit, one bedroom, to a $3,000 apartment in a brand new build, sure, a certain portion of that is going to cover the build cost, but a large portion of that is also covering the operating costs. A one-bedroom rent-stabilized apartment, 40% of the rent goes to property taxes. So if we're not lowering the property tax burden, you're not doing anything to lower the rent burden.
Another policy that I'm sure will be discussed and is being discussed for the last 2 years or so is good cause eviction. Do you have a status update on that?
Yeah, I'd say same with 421A. The entire housing conversation has been caught up. And this is unfortunately how Albany works in a grand deal. In other words, the governor has staked her position on 421A and getting upzoning across the state. That's what she wants. The legislature has staked their position on getting good cause eviction. And those loggerheads and that contradiction, that's what kept anything from happening this past session. The question is, how long does that standoff last? That will be determinative of what happens. So good cause is 50-50 at this point, and I think that is because it's tied up with 421A and everything else. All of it is 50-50. And so it will be a question of who blinks first.
From just to take a look at the tenant's viewpoint on this. So you mentioned about the 90%, that middle 90%. Do you see a middle 90% in the tenant advocate group?
No. I would say the advocate group is probably more in the 5% of the extreme on either side. Look, I meet with everyone. I've met with the leaders of the Housing Justice for All movement, the Democratic Socialists of America. I've met with everyone. I've tried to have rational conversations. Our vacancy bill, I looped them into the process very early on because I knew they would be the strongest opponents. I've met with legal aid, the legal aid attorneys who, frankly, were the ones that drafted and wrote HSTPA in 2019 and provided it to the legislature to pass. And they are in a position, or they've taken the position against housing where they are unable to see any benefit for a property owner that doesn't hurt a renter. And so it's unfortunate that they've taken such an extreme position. But I think from our point of view, we're not speaking to those extreme groups anymore. We're going to need to speak to the renters themselves, because a renter has to understand that every time the property tax burden goes up on a building, it affects their rents. It affects the owner's ability to maintain the building. And I think if more renters understood that, they understood how much they're paying towards property taxes, how much when utility costs go up, they're paying of that, how they are a part of this entire process, I think it's helpful. Certainly some won't care. They'll just not want their rent to be raised. Hell, I don't want my rent to be raised either. But if I understood that the owner had to raise my rent $100 that year because that person's insurance costs have tripled in the last 10 years, and the insurance is required for them to operate the building, which we're seeing in parts of the Bronx and Upper Manhattan especially, or that insurance companies are actually asking property owners how many vouchers they have in the unit, how many subsidized Section 8 housing vouchers, and then dropping people based off of how many vouchers they have, then I would have a much better understanding of the economics that are at play on my rent. And I think that's necessary because renters are the political currency that are going to change the laws on either side. They're the ones that lawmakers use to get punitive laws passed against us, and they're the ones we have to work with to get the laws amended at some point to help our owners.
So you can't live with them and you can't live without them.
Yes.
Yep. But you're taking an interesting tact of cutting straight through the people representing those groups and now going straight to...
Yeah, we have to, unfortunately, because I don't think they're even representing the best interests of renters anymore.
Mm-hmm. And in your own words, how would you describe their viewpoints, say a tenant advocate's viewpoint?
I'm curious to follow Jay around.
Yes, but they say that helps conflict resolution when the other side has to describe what the other party...
Look, I think it starts off, as all things start off, with good intentions, and then it becomes kind of a zealotry that turns into a radicalism. And I think that's where a majority of the tenant groups have kind of settled into. And then it becomes self-perpetuating. The conflict between property owner and tenant is now required for some of these groups to continue to exist. There's no natural incentive then to broker a peace, to come up with solutions that benefit both parties, because then funding dries up. Motivation to get volunteers dries up. So I think then it becomes self-fulfilling. So look, I always try to remind myself, their intents started off at a good place, I believe, which is to stand up for people they view as on the social spectrum, economic spectrum, marginalized. And so I empathize with that because I'm trying to do everything I can to not hurt those people as well while protecting my own owner's interests. But at the same time, it has, over decades, as the solution hasn't provided itself through the policies they've been promoting, turned into more radicalism. And I don't think it's beneficial to renters at all.
Mm-hmm.
Key takeaways for me during COVID was that the landlords that have the best relationships with their tenants have the highest collections.
100%.
Partnership, yeah, like.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and we're seeing that I think now too.
Yeah.
And if you're told by a tenant group, to go back to the prior question, to hate your landlord, to not trust them, that any effort to collect rent is an effort to harass, because we've seen this. This is the rhetoric they use. That if you have a maintenance request, don't call your landlord to dial 311 first to get a violation instead. Right. And not even give the owner the chance to cure the issue in the apartment before calling 311. Then you cannot come from the mentality of understanding, right? Helping how the building operates. So I think if owners start, if we as the industry and as property owners, brokers, whoever we are in the process, start working to meet that difference with renters and understanding that it's collaborative and that your customers at the end of the day of a product that we're providing, I think we can kind of neutralize their extreme perspective of not wanting to work with property owners.
Awesome. We're recording this November 2023, and the most recent punch, if you want to call it that, was the so-called Frankenstein loophole, and these sub-rehabs getting those loopholes getting closed, and for want of a better word, they're off the table now, right? So housing advocates or tenant advocates say that these Frankenstein laws they incentivize owners to create housing, and then on the other side of it, housing providers say that these loopholes are very, very important, and if without the ability to split the units, that they're going to create an issue and actually cause housing demand to go up.
Yeah.
So which side of that coin is right?
Well, I obviously I know which side is, and I think you do too in the question. But the laws that were promulgated and recently codified and put into action are unfortunate. I think they are more of the same, believing the rhetoric of Legal Aid Society and other tenant groups, and that an owner's motivation is always profit at the end of the day. But that profit is directly tied to revenue. And I'd say that revenue is essential to the building's health and well-being, which is essential to the health and well-being and satisfaction of the renters that currently exist in the building. So if you have 2 units and you have a family of 5, but you have 2 one-bedroom units and you want to combine the 2 units for a family of 5, why would passing that law be more beneficial? A law which prohibits the combination of the units be beneficial to the family of 5 when you only have 2 one-bedrooms? You're going to make them live in 2 separate apartments now? Or you have 5 students from Columbia who want a large suite, a 3 or 4 bedroom suite that you want to combine and put together for them. You're told now that, well, if you do that, you have to set a rent that is an average of the 5 apartments instead of setting a new first rent, all because we're told that owners were doing this to harass people out to get new first rents. It's all getting back to the same mentality, that this belief that owners are always acting from a nefarious position and not from trying to accommodate housing to their customers. And I think that's where these laws started from. That's where they've come from. And even worse, there are 2 bills on the governor's desk now that would take the regulations and codify them in law, and then also add look-back periods to overcharge complaints, that we're strongly encouraging the governor to veto these 2 bills, that it would essentially reverse the Regina decision, which allows a tenant to claim an overcharge complaint, which would go essentially back to the dawn of time of the building. That would be so detrimental to the housing market. You cannot price the value of a building because you will not know the liability. You could not know that if the property owner that you bought the building from 15 years ago accidentally did an overcharge in their registration, you would have no way of knowing that because you bought the building 8 years ago and you don't have the paperwork from a prior owner from 10 years ago. But now you're going to be held liable for the potential, and the way the bills are written, any mistake is codified as fraud. Not a mistake, it's fraud. So the burden of proof is on the lawmaker, or is on the property owner to prove that it wasn't intentional, the overcharge complaint. So you're going to lose if those laws get passed, and you'll have no ability to really know what your liability is on any building you've purchased. So we're pushing for a veto on those two bills. The regulations are bad in and of themselves. Those laws are even worse.
Until he's aware of the 30,000 units survey.
So they're aware. I think some are in denial of that it's that many. I think some are hanging on to the housing vacancy survey, which we know is a survey. It's an estimate, and it's a picture in time from. It's always 18 months behind anyway. So that said it was about 3,000 units. It also said there were several thousand other vacancies, but there's no way of knowing the permanency of those vacancies because it's just a question of, is the unit vacant? Well, yes, but is it in between leasing? Is it in between, is it temporarily on turnover? So we believe it's 30,000 based off of cross-referencing Department of Finance apartment registrations. We've pulled RPIEs to try and get a very good idea of how many there are. Some in the tenant groups have said it's as high as 80,000 based off of other estimates that they're coming up with. But we're confident in saying it's about 30,000. And our goal, to your point on education, is getting as many lawmakers to know that number is 30, and it's growing. It's only going to get worse as leases end and long-term occupied apartments become vacant, with no mechanism for the owner to invest the 100,000 plus that's needed.
Awesome. In closing, what's next for Chip? I know you guys do a great job. You're out representing the break and do a great job. What's next? I know you've got the political session coming in January, so that's probably at the top of your mind right now.
Any silver linings that on the horizon?
Look, the silver lining is that it's New York, and I think even in this market, an optimist would look at this and the devaluation of some of the properties and look, and I tell this to lawmakers and they half chuckle, but I said, if you guys want to become the largest multifamily rent stabilized property owners in the country, you could quickly become with very little buy-in right now. And I know many brokers I could refer you to. The devaluation could be an opportunity for people who are smart, who understand that this is New York, and you may lose money investing in the capital, but you're buying property that is selling for much less than it's actually worth, I would argue, because it is New York City and the demand is always going to be there. The fact that the vacancy rate is so low is because people want and need to live in New York City. So I'd say the silver lining is that lawmakers have to work with us eventually, whether they realize it or not, to solve this problem, because we are so integral to the process of housing New Yorkers. And yes, we're focusing on legislative session. The governor will deliver her State of the State in January, her budget, and it will be in February and then due in April. Housing will be a number one issue for years to come. And as long as we as an industry understand our role in it, I think lawmakers will eventually realize they have to work with us to fix the problem.
Amazing.
Right.
Jay Martin, thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
And thanks for all the work you do too, Craig.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Cheers.